Good afternoon. It's actually afternoon here in Germany. It's now 14:21. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. The US dollar is the strongest export and the most lethal weapon the United States has. They weaponize the dollar by lending it out and even force countries to adopt it as a legal tender. So, question is, how did the US get almost the whole world to use the US dollar? For most countries, basically like most African countries, they kind of pick it and wrap it up into some kind of a package. And one of these packages is, for example, the US aid. It works almost 100% for countries that are struggling with their economy. They come in and they say, we're going to alleviate you from some of the problems that you're going through, some of the problems that you're facing, such as building roads, hospitals, schools, ports, and harbors, those very important infrastructures that maybe Africa needs. The jackals would get into those targeted countries. So who are the jackals? The jackals are just mostly, I think, always former military personnel. They are trained to be very target oriented. So they come into those targeted countries with a package. And it's not like it's an option, it's a must. If the leader of that particular country rejects the US aid, they simply have to execute the next plan, which is to overthrow that very particular leader or even have that person assassinated and replace him with another, mostly of their own choice. We have seen this. There's certain examples like Ghana, they had Jerry J. Rawlings. He's a Ghanaian. He was a Ghanaian, trained and educated by the United States, mostly for these purposes. The other classic example is Charles Taylor from Liberia. Charles Taylor is a Liberian. He was trained and educated in the United States in Massachusetts, Boston. It's pretty much the same as Samuel Doe. So that's what they basically do. They get you to choose. Most Africans feel like when they go for elections, they are choosing a leader that they feel they should be represented by. It is not true. You are given a leader. You don't get to choose them. So now these corrupt leaders accept this US aid and actually makes it public in their parliaments or media. And of course, many of those terms of conditions of that aid is that you have to employ American countries or Western firms to build those cardinal long-awaited infrastructures because they have the expertise and the experience. And of course they do. And then you get the IMF loan and the World Bank. And it's pretty much, they are all the same. IMF and World Bank, they are the same. And these loans were never meant to be paid back. The IMF loans or the US aid loans, they were never meant to be paid back at all. It's to hold those countries captive so they can dictate how the economy or that country has to be governed. It's just that simple. It's not such a difficult theory. Imagine, how could you have a country like Nigeria not being able to repay back its debt to France or IMF? That country is so wealthy in natural resources. But it's just like they got tangled up in this situation where the interests keep soaring and increasing, and the economy or the government is actually dictated by outsiders. So now you're in a position where you're not able to repay your loan with interest. They come with small prints in their terms of conditions. You have to privatize your telecommunication industry, privatize your ports. You should remove subsidies on your fuel because that's how you're going to repay back the loans. Maybe half of it, that's what they say. We're just giving you some sort of sound financial advice. That's how they put it. Now you are in a mess. It is such a critical mess. Now they come in and just begin to get into one of the most really, I would call it the hub of Africa, which is agriculture. Africans have always survived on agriculture. It's mostly in so many countries, it's the biggest sector. And it does not only sustain the livelihood of those struggling people, it is a source of income for most people in African countries. So they come in and they say, instead of planting the crops you feel you need for subsistence farming or for subsistence sustainability, how about you plant cocoa, coffee, which is easier for you guys to export and make more money. You can sell it to the West or to European countries. And at the end, you can repay some of these loans. But that's not true. At the end, you are still in debt and you cannot even feed your own nation. This is how the whole entire empire works, weaponizes its power. I would recommend you guys read a book by, I think, John Perkins. It's The Confession of the Economic Hitman. It's a pretty good book. Read it and you will find out. So right now, Kenya is on its tunnels of protests and it's not in a good shape, guys. Majority of you know what's going on in Kenya. So the president, Mr. Ruto, for some reason, flies to the United States, hold some sort of state talks with Joe Biden and some other high-ranking American government officials, comes back and imposes a tax on his own people without even having to consider increasing salaries of those people. Here in Germany, the moment inflation hits just a decimal fraction, there is always a salary increment. People don't even have to protest. We saw a lot of protests this year because, the unions were not in a position to negotiate. We saw a lot of protests because inflation went up to 7, even 9% here in Germany. And people got a pay raise. Now, this Kenyan president comes back from the United States as a puppet and increases tax and it sends the masses of innocent Kenyans on the streets to demonstrate. So hard that they turned into brutalizing and even killing more than 200 plus innocent young Kenyans who were just protesting, demanding a decent life from a person they actually thought was going to represent, their sustainable lives because of $1. And now he comes on the platform and says, well, I withdraw the tax reform. But now because I withdraw the tax reform, I'm taking Kenya 35 years behind because we have to borrow 3 trillion shillings to run the government. Are you serious? How would you borrow 3 trillion shillings to finance the loans from the same people you got the loan? Weird. The other thing is, how did the Zimbabwean government, how did they opt to using the US dollar as a legal tender? Just how? Guys, I'm not from Zimbabwe. I'm not from Kenya. But right now, if you visit Zimbabwe, you will have to pay with the US dollar. Their ATMs will spit brand new, fresh, genuine US dollars that you use in Zimbabwe for transactions. But the whole thing is Zimbabwe got into the worst decadence ever just because of one action. The former president, Robert Mugabe, after a long time of frustration seeing his population growing but being led into extreme poverty, while one particular human race was getting rich and richer and richer, the former Rhodesian white folks. So he came up with a plan of actually asking his countrymen to repossess their land because land is very important. He urged his people to repossess it because it belongs to them to repossess that land. So it sent the country into chaos and sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe. And that was the beginning of the downfall of Zimbabwe. Not any particular African country imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. No, it was the outside world. So Zimbabwe hit the deepest decadent ever. But on April 8th, 2024, Zimbabwe launched a new currency called the ZiG, which is backed by the dollar. But they could not actually launch it and use it. 85% of transactions in Zimbabwe take place or are conducted using the US dollar. They actually wanted to use the US dollar until 2025, but they were being forced to use it until 2020. The question is, if you look at the economic aspects of using a dollar, a US dollar, in an African country, the American GDP, national gross product, it's not the same as Zimbabwe. They do have the American sort of fast food industry stores, like they have KFC. If you go to KFC in Zimbabwe, you would have had to pay almost the same as you would be paying in the United States, but you're in Zimbabwe. Your income is not even that related. That is the global domination of the US dollar. In a time where we're supposed to be growing economically, detaching ourselves from all these aspects of being oppressed by a currency, we're pulling ourselves so deep and heading for decadence. Follow for some more.